You've spent a lot of your career with lichens. I was reading on your Wikipedia page, you've collected over 19,000 different specimens of them. I don't think a lot of people know, and this might not be what a lot of the gardeners and people into agriculture want to admit, what lichens are. Their simplest form, what is a lichen?
Lichen is just a symbiotic organism of a combination of a fungi with some sort of algae, and sometimes a secondary fungi.
So you could have two different fungi and one algae that have came together to form one unique lichen.
Yeah. So it's a little messy classification process. And rather than like with vascular plants that was started with Linnaeus, it's more closely allied and named by the fungi that's the association, and not by the algae. A lot of the algae are in one genus of algae called Trabuxia. About 70% of lichens are in that group. So it's mostly a lot of different fungi that farm algae.
So that's interesting right there.
Yeah.
Fungi are farming algae. Can you explain how that relationship is working?
Well, it's like in nature, all these associations between symbiotic, holistic, parasitic. It's really more of a gradient between those with different organisms. And some lichens, in fact, only occur on like rotten wood and are somewhat associated with fungi in the rotten wood even. But most lichens are free living, one algae, one fungi growing together in a inhospitable location, able to live in this site that nobody else can live. And that's pretty neat. So, on the side of a tree, the same lichen that grows on the side of a tree in humid conditions sometimes grows on the side of a metal guardrail. Or when you park a car too long in Oregon, it'll start growing lichens on it. They're not getting any nutrients from it. It's just a location. They're just like building up skyscrapers in the sky, and they start occupying tree limbs, and wherever they can grow, they'll grow.
Are lichens only a thing in terms of classification, meaning a lichen is considered like one unit when you classify, but at a biological level, if you really zoomed in, you have two things that are operating together that make that lichen. You have the algae and the fungi that have came together. Yeah. So they're separate, but when they operate together, that's what a lichen is?
Correct. And so they're like little ecosystems of their own. But we do the same thing with tree species. We name tree species, but almost all trees, particularly pine trees, have mycorrhizal fungi associated with their roots, and they never grow without those fungi. So in a way, they're symbiotic too. And the most common tree in North America, Western North America, is the Douglas fir tree. And the Douglas fir tree, whenever anyone does a detailed study of it, they find somewhere between 40 and 60 different fungi that associate with the living roots and help absorb nutrients and water. So, almost everything that we call a separate entity, and we like to name things, but everything is kind of a system. It's a complex system of more than one organism often.
The fungi that associate with lichens, are those fungi that would be able to freely survive on their own if they didn't have this symbiotic relationship?
It's thought not to. They have to be lichenized to to survive in these habitats. You don't find many of them just growing on their own.
Symbiotic relationship, they're all over. I mean, humans have them, right? Like we're more, I think, bacterial by DNA than we are human. If we look at the two parts, the algae, the fungi, what is each one bringing to the table that benefits the other?
Mm-hmm. I think in a lot of associations it varies to some extent, but in the kind of the big picture, the algae produces the carbohydrates or foods, and the fungi produces the housing or protection for the organism. And the algae needs protection because one, it'll either dry up and die, or two, some invertebrate will come along and eat it. And the lichen is able to afford it protection from desiccation because it'll dry out and make a protective coating of it. And often those fungi have antibacterial properties. So things like penicillin is an example of a fungi producing antibacterial. And then, and in like World War II, they didn't have penicillin. They used this chemical called usnic acid. And they harvested usnic acid from lichens. And that was the universal antibiotic. So, 60 years ago, lichens were a much bigger deal in medicine because they were antibacterial.
If we look at one part of it, algae, I'm assuming most people know what algae is, but I think when people think of algae, they think of it in association with a body of water. It's in a pond, it's in a lake.
Mm-hmm.
How much of algae, the species, maybe that's not the right term, but when you look at algae as a group, how many are more terrestrial based and don't live in bodies of water?
Yeah, not that many. Most algae require more moisture.
So you have this unique algae that it's out of the norm and it finds a spot like, hey, I want to live here. It forms a relationship with this fungi to become a lichen, and they exchange carbohydrates for protection.
Mm-hmm.
So the algae is producing carbohydrates through photosynthesis. How is the fungi protecting it while still allowing it to photosynthesize? If it's not like, is it clear? Like making it almost like a glass?
It actually will act more like a sunscreen, because a lot of times what's damaging for free living algae are the UV lights and the intensity of the light. So it's the fungi tends to provide protection from sunburning, so to speak. And the fungi often becomes more pigmented when it's in full sun versus partial shade. So some fungi will look somewhat green when they're in the shade of a tree. When they're at the tips of the branches, they will be more orange colored and produce more pigment. And their goal is to provide the perfect greenhouse for the algae. They don't want it too bright, just like the three bears. They don't want it too bright, too dark, just right. And that's what the lichen kind of does. and then it physically protects those algal cells from invertebrates, insects, or other organisms that might eat them.
Because it's unpalatable to those
Or
insects.
either that or just physically separates it. You know, when it's dried up and it's got this fungal material there with a few, often with some chemicals in it that make it less palatable. They'll still eat it sometimes, like slugs and snails will eat lichens. Some insects will eat them, but not a lot of them. And they can also physically exist better as a lichenized unit rather than as separate lichen, fungi, and algae.
Is the fungi mining any of the support structure that it's on for minerals? Obviously, if it's on a metal signpost, I don't think it's breaking that down. But if it's on the side of a tree, is it going into that bark, pulling anything out of it?
Generally, it's thought that it does not. There are a few exceptions to that. Like I mentioned, there's one lichen, and maybe because it's not economically important, they haven't pursued it or tried to discover, but it tends to only occur in rotten wood. So I assume it's getting something from the rotten wood. But we don't really know that it's getting any phosphates or anything like that.
For a lichen that grows on the side of a rock, what's the ecological function of that? What is it doing in the zoomed out long geological timescale to that ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a good question. What they kind of think about is it's just increasing biodiversity. It grows there, but in fact, when you have wet periods, insects will eat it. In Idaho here, I've seen wet days when the sheep will scrape the lichens off the rocks and eat them. So they contribute to food value. Sometimes there's quite a few animals that eat lichens, you know, flying squirrels, deer, elk, and it's often thought that they are eating them just like you or I might eat potato chips, because they satisfy some minor nutrients that we crave, like salt, phosphates, things like that. Lichens tend to be, you know, almost 200 times higher in phosphates, nitrogen, some of those things than many other plant tissues.
Why is that?
They're kind of, lichens don't have like waxy outer coating or stomata to regulate what comes in and out. So lichens, particularly up in a tree, they're just a sponge. They absorb all kinds of nutrients out of the air. In fact, you know, like when were atomic test trials in Russia, it contaminated lichens in Alaska from the air drift of the radioactivity. The radioactivity didn't go into a lot of the vascular plants. And if it did, it cycled out quickly. But with the lichens, they concentrated. And then the Eskimos were eating the caribou that ate the lichens, and were getting real high doses of radiation from the concentration up the food chain of radionuclides. So they just absorb. They're just like a sponge sitting there taking in anything. You know, they take in air pollution. That's why they're good indicators of sulfur dioxide, nitric oxides, those sorts of things. They don't really differentiate. They just kind of like take it all in and and hang on to it.
Is that the algal component or the fungal component that drives that?
More the fungal component.
So they're kind of like scrubbers of the air and
Yeah.
bioaccumulators. So eventually, like they either fall off the rock, they get knocked off the rock, they get consumed. Whatever consumes it
Hmm.
then redistributes those nutrients through its feces or through its body when it
Yeah.
eventually recycles back.
And to fully answer your question from what's the lichen on a rock, which is a pretty passive organism, it kind of has two main functions. One is that insects or small mammals can directly eat it when it's moist, usually. Or secondly, when they're moist, they absorb water, of course, and they help retain moisture like a sponge on that rock. And so they freeze and they contribute to the erosion of the rock. That's one of the famous attributes of a lichen to, actually, form soil from hard rocks. And, that depends a lot on the type of rock. I see soft rocks like, oh, some of the rocks in the Canyonlands area of Utah. They get lichens on them, and the lichens grow for 2 or 3 years, and then they peel off, and they take with it, 4 or 5 millimeters of sandstone with them. So they're helping erode the rock very quickly. Well, granite rocks, you might have a lichen that's growing on there that's 6,000 years old, and it may be breaking the rock down, but at a very, definitely a very slow pace.
Is it that thaw freeze cycle that's breaking it down, or is the fungi putting enzymes into the rock that
Mhm.
help it break apart?
A little bit of both, but mostly probably the physical frost heaving. And you see, if the lichen wasn't there, the moisture would drain off the rock.
Right.
But because it's there, it holds that moisture longer and causes the frost to have a larger impact on the rock feature.
What's the biological incentive for the lichen to fall off? Can it then be carried somewhere else to reproduce?
It can be, and it can just contribute to plain soil formation. It can be eaten, but it's you know sometimes people think of these crustose lichens on a granitic rock as lichens growing in toward each other, having a little battle over who can overgrow the other one. It's like a slow motion battlefield.
Like two totally different types.
Two different species kind of trying to grow over each other.
What
Usually, one has an advantage. The
what
advantage is either faster growing or a chemical advantage. And lichens have over 1,000 chemicals that they produce that are unique to lichens. And they only produce those unique lichen acids, they're called, when they're in the lichenized state. People have taken the two organisms and separated them and grown them on agar or whatever, or in liquid medium, and they will not produce those chemicals. They only produce the chemicals as a unit.
when you look at those thousand things they can produce in symbiosis, what what are some of the more unique ones you think that stand out or the interesting ones for people that they wouldn't assume?
Well, I think that the one outstanding one is one that's very common, which is causes a light green or yellow green color, and that's the usnic acid, which was used as an antibiotic before penicillin. The other groups of chemicals we don't always know a lot about because some of the people who study them consider that information trade secrets. And they're usually financed by paint companies. So there's a fair amount of lichen acids that are added to paint to make the paint last longer. And we don't really know what some of those chemicals are. They're kind of trade secrets.
Is that something you could farm? Like, could you, if you were after that, or they have to wild harvest that?
You know, we don't really know because the chemical companies that deal with it, you know, they probably figure it out, isolate it, and then they might make it artificially, which is what we tend to do in chemistry nowadays. But to discover them, they're always, it seems like a lot of the paint companies hire lichenologists and are always doing experiments, paying to get certain species of lichens to study. So it's got to be a somewhat lucrative industry if they're willing to buy these things.
You had to suppose, knowing what you know about the organism, what do you think those chemicals are providing to the species?
I'm suspect in the case of the paint that they're just some sort of sun blocking organisms, you know, that pigments that help deal with UV light. But I'm not sure. And there's a growing field of medicine looking at all kinds of endemic plants and lichens.
What's the oldest species of lichen out there, or longest lived, I should say? Like, what do you have estimates on that?
I don't have like which species, but it would be these crustose species that grow on rock. You know, the one that comes to mind to me is one often referred to in the literature as map lichen. It is kind of bright green, almost like the color of the shirt I'm wearing today, and it grows on rock and has black reproductive structures mixed in with it. And it's called map lichen, and it's historic because it makes these big patches on rocks out kind of standing in the middle of nowhere. And historically, explorers used to scratch. Lichen's easier to write in than the rock itself, you know. So they leave messages or maps, directional arrows in those lichens where they're, you know, when they split into two parties or something, you know,
Yeah.
like, you know, whether it's the Lewis and Clark expedition or often famous are some of these Arctic expeditions where they split up and then supposed to meet back at this big rock, you know, and they get there and it's like, you know, they got tired of waiting for them and they write in that lichen. And the lichen patch, it can be, you know, the size of a basketball. And those are considered pretty old. I'm not sure, you know, I think in the literature, there's a whole body of literature where they try to date glacial moraines and things by the size of the lichens that are growing there since the glacier receded. And, you know, there's some that are known to be 6,000 years old.
So that's older than the oldest trees.
Yeah.
What is it, these protective properties in the acids that, you know, UV is going to break everything down eventually?
Yeah.
Or something's going to come along and eat it, or
Mhm.
eventually it just, it gets sick and dies. So here you have something 6,000 years old.
Yeah,
All these chemicals are protecting it, enabling it to live that long.
that's what we assume. Yeah, and it's a you know how the lichens will make a continuous colony. That's they base it on the size of that colony. That this lichen in this environment grows so slow. I've done this with rock faults in Idaho, and we compare it to gravestones of similar granitic rock, and we find lichens that are so big and they're 200 years old. So then when we find that same species of lichen nearby, which would be in the same climatic zone, and it's 12 inches in across, you extrapolate to the age of the lichen, and so it's pretty long lived.
Does it genetically evolve over time?
It will, because at least the fungal part is reproducing. And we have, you have in North America, they figure around 10,000 different species of lichen. So we're still in the survey era for lichens. People are, in fact, to my chagrin, I kind of like lichen ecology, and a lot of good lichenologists get wrapped up in just naming new lichens. And that, to me, that kind of sidetracks them from some other valuable work. They could be doing something more useful, maybe. Uh, Finding indicators, lichens as good indicators of something, if they weren't so busy naming new species. But it's I think it's a little bit contagious for people.
You have a lichen on a rock here, and then you have the same type on a rock over here. How does it get from A to B?
Mm-hmm. Even reproduction on lichens is a little bit iffy. In theory, the lichen reproduces by the fungi reproduce. The algae are just contained within and just divide by binary fission. And so the spores from lichen A go off into the air, and they have to land on a substrate and find an algae cell. And it's often thought that there's like any other plant organism, there are many species of lichens that reproduce vegetatively. They have specialized structure that just break off and grow. And those asexual reproductive structures have both fungal hyphae and algal cells mixed in with them. So they start growing, and those are fast growing lichens in general. So it's often thought that these more slower growing lichen species, they kind of capture the algae from the other lichens and imprison it, so to speak, and make them work for them.
So the fungal
Because there's
spore goes out there, and it's just, let's
goes
call it
out there.
like a random, like, hey, I just throw a bunch of dust in the air.
Yeah.
Wherever it
I,
lands, it has to just kind of coincidentally, one of
yes,
those spores has to land
in
basically
the right
on.
spot.
Right.
Yeah. That's pretty hard to happen. But that's why we don't know, like some people are unclear on, how do some of these lichens get around so well? Because they seem to get around dispersed pretty well, but it's hard to find them in nature. The early stages of lichen.
If that spore lands on another lichen, it
Mm-hmm.
could potentially, the fungi could compete for those algal cells?
Correct. Yeah. And they know a few lichens tend to do that. They even have a sequence of what they really call colonizing or parasitizing lichens. So that often it starts with a ubiquitous or cosmopolitan lichen. Now pick some genus like Cladonia, which are the reindeer lichens. So this Cladonia tends to occur quite commonly, and it spreads by vegetative means. Fragmentation, specialized fragments called Ceridia and Isidia. It's grown a lot of places. Then lichen species B sends a spore out, and that spore can land on that and parasitize it. And kind of, or, not necessarily parasitize, but outcompete the Cladonia and take over those algae. And they've documented that in just a handful of species. So you go from a Cladonia, and then your site's pretty stable for a while, like 20 years, and you might get second species called Diploschistes muscorum. And then Diploschistes muscorum has a Acarospora species, a lichen that tends to grow on top of it and take over its algae. And that's, you probably, this is in a grassland situation. You need about 50 years of stable grassland for that to happen. And then you start getting lots of this Acarospora sliceri, which is a green lichen similar to the map lichen that grows on rocks a lot. And so there's an example where they know there's this 3 species association. Species A gets colonized by species B. Species C tends to colonize species B. So it's pretty that's been worked out for it. But for the other 9,099 lichens, we're not sure how they always reproduce. And then I'll tell you, there's a lot of lichens that reproduce without any vegetative means. Well, you have to admit that the most common lichens tend to have vegetative reproduction, some form of specialized asexual reproduction.
Can they survive going through the digestive tract of an animal that eats them and then reproduce that way?
Generally not. Now they do, like there are studies where people study dust and air and stuff, and there's pretty consistent findings that in Reno, Nevada, they have one of these air sampling sites, and they pick up lichen spores, lichen fragments from Mongolia all the time. So some of these spores are quite small and they just go everywhere. If we're getting spores in Reno, Nevada from Mongolia, that's pretty amazing.
So they're one of those things that's literally all over the world. We walk by it every day and have no clue that it's really even there.
Yeah.
Why just algae? Why aren't there fungi that have formed relationships with terrestrial plants? I know they have on the roots, but if you look at the same principle, hey, we need carbohydrates. Why are they not on the leaves of plants?
Well, they are, but when they're on the leaves, they're often considered diseases and stuff, damping off of seedlings. When seedlings are young, that's when they haven't built their waxy epidermis on the leaves. They damp off. That's just a fungus growing on it. They're usually quite damaging. Pine trees get all kinds of pine wilt. They get pine wilt. They get a whole variety of smuts, fungi that grow on them. They usually need more moisture. Something like there's a snow smut when branches of conifers get buried in the snow. They often get covered by a black fungus, and then our that branch dies. But people don't really focus on those much because they're very ephemeral. It dies. It's all covered with this black stuff, but 2 weeks later, they all fall to the ground. Nobody notices. But I know I have friends who they got into lichens, and they start getting into these like tree diseases, and they get hired by a tree company, and they work on that for the rest of their lives. It's very similar techniques. Microscope type stuff to figure out what's going on.
In those
But
cases, they're killing the host.
yeah, mostly they're killing the host. They don't seem to have developed a lot of symbiotic relationships up high.
In in soils, are there lichens in the soil? People listening as gardeners, farmers, we have lichens in the
Yeah.
soil that we're using.
Usually lichens don't like being buried, and there's very few aquatic lichens, but there's a few. Generally speaking, in those moist environments, they don't, they're not as well suited for. They like to be moist and dry, moist and dry. If it's wet all the time, there's other organisms that seem to be able to outcompete them.
When you talk fast growing lichens, how fast is fast? To put it in
Yeah.
human logic.
Okay. Like I had this study we did for 10 years. We looked at the kind of the dynamics of lichens on the roof of a shed. And it was pretty dynamic. There was a lot of changing, shifting, dying, growing. And a lot of times you got a lichen the size of a dime or a quarter that grew that big in 2 years. That's fast growing. And, a lot of times those are in high nitrogen environments, nitrophilic lichens that love high nitrogen, like in barnyards and things like that. And they often, when you have fast growing lichens, you tend to just have fast growing lichens. You don't tend to have a lot of chemicals with them. They kind of skip that metabolic step because making those chemicals is a big energy expenditure. And if you're in a good growing environment, you just grow, 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 and don't worry about it.
What's the purpose of color? I mean, you mentioned reds, yellows, greens, browns, blacks. If you think color in nature, it's to attract a mate, it's to attract something to consume it. Why these different colors? Or are they just happenstance? I make a chemical I need and it shows up to us as red.
I think it's happenstance plus sunscreening. You know, like I mentioned, the orange lichens that can that can be green in the shade but orange in the sun. Those orange pigments are being produced not as accessory pigments like in vascular plants where they pass excited electrons on to another, the chlorophyll A system. They they tend to just be more pigments that are trying to block out the sun and provide optimal but low light conditions for the growth of the algae. and they try to filter out UV light.
If they're growing on a rock, they can't go mine water. Like roots go down and find it in the soil. They have to catch what falls on them or condense it out of the air. How are most of these lichens getting the water they need to survive, or have they specialized to get that water?
That's interesting you asked that question when I go to get water. The environment where they grow, these habitats, it's like they grow where there's that amount of water. You see on a tree, there's patterns where the water runs down the trunk of a tree, and you'll get more lichens where the water runs. And in dry sites, there's some lichens that like to grow with humidity and no water. They don't like water.
Is the fungi creating some sort of spongy structure to hold that?
They can at times because they're fibrous, or have pores in them, so they're in the medulla of the fungi. It's somewhat spongy like, but the mostly the lichens move to the suitable moisture regime, and that could be on the underside of a cliff where it never gets liquid water, but it gets a lot of humidity in the winter. There's certain lichens that'll grow on those surfaces, and we assume that they're growing there because, hey, nobody else is growing there. They got no competition. They can be king of the hill there because nobody else can handle it.
I know there's estimates I'm looking at here. Fungi, yeast, mold, mushrooms, or they estimate are about 2% of the world's biomass. Any idea where lichens fall into that?
I don't. They're not big, heavy things. I think the ecosystem services of lichens are things related to erosion, like lichens that grow on the ground in grasslands help prevent erosion. Lichens in the trees in a forest help kind of damper or be a hydro buffer when you have storms. So they absorb a lot of water during the storm and then release it slowly later. They provide food. Often the food they provide for, let's say, deer and elk, which are more commonly concerned about than insect food habits. Deer and elk are eating lichens in the winter when there's heavy snowfall or some other, like emergency. So they're really valuable because they're food at a critical time, but they're not necessarily a large biomass, except for caribou. Caribou tend to specialize on lichens and deal with them. But most organisms, most bighorn sheep or other ungulates are eating lichens as a kind of emergency food, not as a main food. And I think that lichens in the ecosystem, their role, their ecosystem services are these things like erosion control, increasing biodiversity, growing where other plants can't grow. Kind of they're kind of on the edges of things. They're not in the basic thick tall grass prairie where you're producing, huge amounts of biomass. They grow on the edges of stressful habitats. They're well known for being, really critical in the Arctic and the alpine areas. So they're kind of extending the plant life to the extremes.
Are they part of the effort that takes those harsh environments and turns them into future grasslands, rocky environments that eventually become soil? Are lichens significant in that development, or is that just erosion through weathering and things like that are doing most of the heavy lifting?
I think they're just a part of that. They're not a major factor. And in fact, if we look around the world at human occupation, and you got very well documented examples of places like Iceland where, you had a lot of lichens and mosses and a few grasses. And as the sheep grazed off the grasses, then the lichens couldn't stay there. They declined, and then the whole place eroded. And a lot of Iceland used to be a lot better ecosystem function, higher ecosystem function. A lot of it has been just degraded by grazing. And the same thing in the Middle East. You go from, I don't know, I did a project in Lebanon where we were looking at the cedars of Lebanon, which are a very tall tree that is very lush. And the Romans conquered the area just to get these tall, strong cedar trees, make a mast out of so they could have faster ships, have the tallest mast, the tallest sails, and rule the seas. Well, most of Lebanon now is just a desert. 8,000 years of overgrazing, and it's the only Lebanon cedars are in preserves and are often protected by rock walls that the Romans had built when they enslaved the locals. And it's, you get a lot of lichens out on those rocks and stuff, but it's a lot. I would say humans tend to cause erosion and degrade plant diversity. There's not a lot of the earth that's making a lot of soil nowadays. We're pretty much mining our soil resources.
So all our soil is gone in the future. We go to some planet X to terraform it. There's
Yeah.
no biology there. Should we bring lichens, and why?
it would probably be a start. It'd be better than nothing, I guess. Yeah.
Just to have them fill that role in the ecosystem of, hey,
Yeah.
they're maybe not doing significant things that we can see with our eyes or really notice, but they're filling a niche in the ecosystem in areas where other things aren't.
If
And
we
that's
look at like arid grasslands in Australia, those are very, very heavily covered with lichens. And then the grasses come in with I say when they have disturbances of the soil surface in any arid system, whether it's in Idaho or Australia, Middle East, lichens and mosses might be the first colonizers. And then later grasses and other things come in. And that rebuilds the soil. They often rebuild the soil by just capturing the dust. Because in our human dominated environment now, we have a lot of dust storms.
Are
And they
they
even
they providing, are they holding on to enough water there for maybe that grass seed to take hold too?
look, basically that's what how it begins. Yeah.
And then the lichen body itself can, when conditions change, it dies. It then adds organic matter, which
Yeah.
gets recycled in.
Hmm. And if we look at your grasslands, you tend to go, from like your more arid grasslands are bunch grasses where they just grow in a bunch because there's not enough water for continuous grass. And so all our desert grasslands out west are bunch grasses. There's a bunch of grass here, and a foot away there's another bunch. And then the lichens grow all in between those bunch grasses and help act as like a mulch to help those. They help with water infiltration and water retention, just like mulch does in your garden. And then when you go to a more moist climate, like in the Midwest, when you get to, Illinois, Iowa, parts of Iowa, some parts of Iowa are shortgrass prairie and have a lot of lichens. Others are tall grass prairie and don't have any because the soils are deeper and the more moisture. You get around the Great Lakes and you get in Ohio and you get a lot more moisture than you do out in eastern Montana. And then you have continuous grassland. But if you denude that, then you got to start over, and you start with the lichens and mosses.
So tree gets a lot of, or a terrestrial plant gets a lot of nutrients from the air to build itself out. A lichen growing on the soil surface in a grassland, it's not taking anything out of the soil. It's sitting there. Where where are the nutrients besides the carbohydrates coming from to build the structure of that organism out?
It'll get some from the air, and you like with trees, you said trees get it from the air, but really trees get most of their nutrition from the ground. They don't have a way of absorbing nutrition through the leaves. They get carbon dioxide through the leaves, but they don't get uh, nitrates and phosphorus. While lichens can absorb those sorts of things from dust and air pollution.
So they're kind of in a way, I guess, then bioaccumulating for that grassland.
Definitely. Yeah, they're good bioaccumulators.
One of the other things that I know you've studied along the way is grass ecology. When you think about that, what are things people don't know about grasslands that they should know?
I think I think the biggest I guess knowledge gap in grasslands is differentiating between rhizomatous grasses and bunch grasses. And they go arm in arm with warm season grasses and cool season grasses. Now, what part of the country do you live in?
Southern California.
Yeah, so you have a warm grassland there. And I've done studies like around Bakersfield, California, which isn't quite, southern, but some people call it Southern California, I guess. And I look at the Carrizo Plain, places like that. Uh, you get a few cool season grasses that grow in the winter and then dry up in the summer, but you get a lot of warm season grasses too. And knowing the difference between warm season and cool season grasses is really critical. A lot of our mentality for ranching in the West, everyone thinks that the buffalo were everywhere. But the buffalo were out in the Great Plains where you had rhizomatous grass. There weren't buffalo in like southern Idaho. There weren't buffalo in Utah to any extent. There's some high elevation sites where they existed, but those had more moisture. But in the valleys and that, you have all these cool season grasses that grow in the winter and then go dormant. And there's nothing for the bison to eat in the summer. And the grasses aren't adapted to being grazed in the summer. So we get grazing in the summer by cows on these bunch grasses, and it kills them. Rhizomatous grasses are adapted to being, having these roots underground with nodes everywhere. Every so often, it has a growing meristem. While bunch grasses just grow straight up, and if you eat that meristem off, you kill the bunch grass. And then we convert to annual grasses, which are flammable. And we pretty much have, because of that lack of knowledge, we've pretty much ruined the Western US at low elevations. And California was heavily altered before we even had records. The California grasslands were, this treasure of grass, and the early Spaniards grazed the heck out of it. And by the time people started taking notes on the ecology of California, the California grassland was gone. And we don't really know what the grasslands used to be like. I did a project for the Fish and Wildlife Service out of San Diego, California, looking for a rare lichen that grew in a grassland. I went around with a kind of a consultant who knew the remnant 33 grassland sites around San Diego. And we spent all week long going to these small little patches of grassland that was thought to be, remnant California grasslands. And we looked at those, we looked at them, and they're all just getting filled in with weedy grasses from Africa, from Europe, from the Middle East. They're just a mess. And it's because of, the bunch grasses that used to grow there just get killed by grazing. While you could graze, cows 12 months of the year in Illinois, where they grow corn, where the tall grass prairie grew, and you couldn't kill that grass because it's that rhizomatous grass, and it just has a whole different way of growing. And that's the biggest thing in grasslands, I think, is understanding how grasses grow and the kind of 4 different categories of grasses: warm and cool season grasses, and rhizomatous and bunch grasses.
You've studied that along with lichens. You've studied a lot of weed management in your career. You received the Idaho Weed Hall of Fame Award. What was your work that led to that?
I think Idaho weed, it was just, consistent hatred of weeds, and just not, just not giving up, just keep trying different things.
Well, if we zoom back at your career with weeds,
Yeah.
what did that focus on?
Well, initially I was just like everybody else. I was learning. I learned a lot, and then I just kept, seeing more and more, and experiencing more, and and I got a little bit with the Bureau of Land Management. We manage huge acreages, like all of Hell's Canyon, for example, or just hundreds of thousands of acres. And we had pastures that I think one of our pastures is 350,000 acres, and there's not much for fences or anything. And a lot of livestock management, you can't manage cows in that kind of pasture, you need paddocks or small pastures if you want to really get the cows to do what you want them to do. You can't get good use out of them when you have hilly country and wide open spaces. They just go where they're lazy. They just go where they want to go. You got to force them to do things. And so I think for me, I got into the biocontrol insects for weeds, and we basically worked on a systematic method of getting a employee to go back to college and study biocontrol insects, and then made him like an agency person who would consult for both the state agencies and the federal agencies and help them with biocontrol insects. That was one of my big pushes.
Were the weeds there weeds that were naturalized to the area, or was this more invasive species you were trying to keep out of the native grasses?
They were more naturalized. I even wrote a little article for the Native Plant Society, this issue, the June issue or spring issue of the Idaho Native Plant Society. I wrote about a little burr buttercup, and it was not very common when I started work here 45 years ago. And now it's everywhere underfoot. And when I researched for that article and talking about it, I said the title of the article was just "Burr Buttercup is not my friend," and I said why, said why, and then I tried to have reasons and tell the history of it. And it was actually first collected in 1940 in Idaho. I had no idea it came in that early, but it was not very well naturalized. It took 50 years before it started to be common. And I think quite a few weeds are here for 50 or 100 years before they become invasive, because they genetically adapt to areas, climate.
Do you buy the notion that they're filling a void? They're providing an ecological function that isn't there anymore, isn't being provided by maybe because of human involvement?
Well, I think nature adorns a vacuum, but I think there were natives that would occur there. There were less noticeable things like lichens that would grow in those spaces. And there is such a thing, particularly in the livestock industry, I'd say lichen blindness, where they can't see it because it's small. And same thing with mosses. These small things grow there. They're particularly when they dry up, they don't look like much of anything. I've even taken serious Forest Service researcher who retired once. He said he came on some science-based field trip that I led. He says, "I've never seen these things. I don't really think they exist." And I showed it to him, and he said, "Oh, they're just really small." He just, in our society, we don't look at the little things that much. We're so, focused on the big things and the sexy things that he just didn't really look closely enough. I was out yesterday on this very lush grassland on the north side of a sagebrush hill, and you almost have to part the grasses with your hands, and they're just starting to dry up this time of year. And the entire soil surface was covered with mosses and a few lichen. And it's just like, I'm sure most of the people, like the ranchers, don't know there's any moss there. They just see the shrubs and the grass. And
If
as they just trample or kill the perennial grass, it gets taken over by the cheatgrass, or the annual flammable grass. That's why we have so many fires in the West.
if there was one unknown about lichens that you could have answered, what would it be?
Maybe that whole thing about uh, understanding more about their ecosystem services. As a scientist, you can't make broad statements really without finding experiments of taking it away and seeing what happens, and it's a difficult in ecology to isolate things. It would be neat to somehow do that, you know.
Do you think every day new lichen species are being created? Some fungal spore lands on a new piece of algae and new lichen.
No, I think there may be some gradient or variation in species, but generally I think a lot of our stuff is, it's already here. It just has to be looked for. And we've got a lot of diversity.
If you had
I
to
don't think
suppose going back in time, how did the first one happen? Was it just total happenstance? You had the right fungi hit the right piece of algae and bam, it worked.
I think a lot of the early colonization on the land was symbiotic. I think even some of the ocean organisms are like coral is very symbiotic too. You know, I mean, corals aren't that different than lichens. They physically look differently, but their corals have algae that live inside them, and so they're kind of like a lichen.
Do any do any true fungi species have a relationship with algae, but they're not considered lichens?
They may, and we some lichen associations are very lichens are kind of we keep that term lichen for those that have physically changed or look differently when they're combined. There are probably some associations, loose associations, where algae grows with a given other organism, but they both retain their original shape. And those are symbiotic, but they're not lichens. We use the term lichen for that unique association where they modify their outward growth form and shape.
Right on. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing, your years of experience doing this. I think people learned a lot. So thanks for taking the time.
Sure. And I'm impressed. You seem to have fairly good grasp of things, and uh, I think look forward to seeing what you end up writing up.
Yeah, right on. And before I let you go, is there anybody in the scientific community related to soils, fungi, soil ecology, carbon cycles, any of that you'd recommend that I talk to?
Oh, there's one guy, David Eldridge, who's pretty into the soils perspective, and he might be interesting to review.
Where's he out of?
He's out of Sydney, Australia, but you could probably Zoom with him just as easy or easier than you did with me, you know?
Okay. Yeah. Do you know, is he associated with the university?
Yeah, I could send you his email.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right on. Yeah.
And and I would say um, I met him because on the internet, this is probably before internet was very cool or well known, you know. He asked this question whether lichens were like more important soil lichens in grasslands. Are they more important functionally, like ecosystem function, or are they more important as a entity? And he's always kept he does a lot of publications promoting their function. You know how they deal with his background is soil scientist, and he's picked up lichens on the side. And he really doesn't do much with lichens anymore. He's actually more into like soil macropores and how do you create that. Sometimes it's lichen, sometimes it's ants or something, you know. How do you get the water into the soil? Because with human disturbance, we're often, you know, they blame flooding on whatever, on weather and all that. But generally speaking, our surfaces are not absorbing water as well as they used to. Whether we compact the soil surface by animal use or decrease vegetative use or pave it over or put a roof on it, we're getting runoff and we're not getting that hydro buffer. And so we lose a lot of our moisture just as runoff. And it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
going into the soil being productive. And he's more, he's kind of wrapped up more in that. And I would say I'm more wrapped up in kind of like an identification and what are they doing and stuff.
Sure.
He's more of a soil scientist. So I could email you his contact.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm always looking for other people to talk to. So I like to ask anybody that I do talk to who else they know and would be interesting
Yeah.
and that'd be great.
And I've visited Australia a few times, and I feel like I click with him more than I do other, like a nerds that just, like I
Right.
say, I feel like they're wasting their value, their their greatness on taxonomy when they should be doing ecology.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, I get it. I
Like,
get it. Right.
because the human race needs the ecology. I, you know, I guess we need to know what we're talking about too, but it's really more important, I feel, to understand what's the ecosystem services are and such.
No, absolutely. I think you need both pieces, but yeah, I don't know, maybe at some point it becomes like a game, right? Like how many can I classify and where do I fit in on the scoreboard?
Yeah,